Welcome to HTML5 Essential Training Series. This is Mike King. I'm your instructor for this tutorial, and this is Styling Elements in HTML Part 3. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about styling elements in HTML using CSS with an external style sheet. So in this tutorial, we'll look at using an external style sheet to style our HTML document. The external style sheet is the preferred method to style our HTML elements, and this is the best way to put styles on our web pages. We've previously looked at inline styling. Then we looked at internal styles, where we actually put styles into the head section of the document, of the HTML page. Now we're actually going to look at using an external document or an external style sheet to style our HTML web document or our web pages. There are many advantages to using external style sheets. An external style sheet is a separate file that your web page is linked to in the head element of the web page that contains all the styles for that web page. One external style sheet can be used to style thousands of pages of a website. Thus, you gain a tremendous amount of consistency by using external style sheets when you design the layout of your websites. By adding class and ID attributes to my HTML elements inside of the HTML document, I can style individual elements consistently across the website by identifying them with a class or an ID attribute. The link element is used to attach an external style sheet to our web page, and numerous link elements can be used in the HTML document inside the head section. So an external style sheet is ideal when the styles you're applying to the web page are applied to many pages. So I'm looking for consistency when I'm styling up my web pages. The external style sheet is the easiest way to get consistency, because by styling one style sheet, I can apply that to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of web pages. By using an external style sheet, you can change the look of an entire website by merely changing the styles in that external style sheet. So I wouldn't have to go back and touch any of those individual HTML pages. I could actually just tweak or modify that external style sheet and change the font across the entire website, whether it was 5 pages or 5,000 pages. The same thing with colors. If I've got a color scheme, I could go and just modify the CSS style sheet and change the color scheme for the entire website instead of having to worry about going in and individually tweaking each page. Each web page must link to the style sheet using the link element, and the link element will always fall inside the head section of the web page. So we're going to move into the development environment, and let's demonstrate what we've been talking about and build an external style sheet for our web page. Alright, so we're inside of our presentation. Let's go ahead and drop out of our presentation, confirm that our environment is set up and ready to go for our demonstrations, our lab exercises. The first thing I'm going to do, let's go look at the web root. You'll notice I'm on Chapter 19, Styling Elements, Part 3. I've got a CSS directory, an images directory, and our basic template as we have in the past. This time we're actually going to use that CSS directory because that's where we're going to store this external style sheet that we're going to create. Let's go and confirm that we've got our web server up and running. And we do. Excellent. Let's bring up our browser window. And we are in HTML Tutorial Styling Elements Part 3. I want to go ahead and bring up my text editor. And now what we want to do is let's go ahead. I'm going to go into my exercise file. I'm going to grab this file that we have in the exercise file and bring it up into my text editor. Alright, so I'm going to go over to my example files. Under example 1, I'm going to go ahead and grab that code for my basic templates. I copy that. Let's go ahead and paste that into our text editor. Let me set this up so you all can get this copied into your editor. Just going to go ahead and take these spaces out. I'm not quite certain why it's adding spaces to it when I bring it in, but it must have something to do with the way I'm saving these files. All right, let me go ahead and save that as a basic template for Chapter 19. And then what I'm going to do, this would be a great time to pause if you need to copy this into your text editor. Let me make sure my word wrap is on, which it is. Great time for it to pause now if you need to take this into your text editor. Then I'm going to go ahead and scroll up. You can type the rest of this. Good time to pause if you need to type the rest of this into your text editor. Alright, what we've got our basic template as we've started with in all our previous tutorials. I'm going to go ahead and load this in our browser window. You can see that we're styling elements in HTML Part 3. This is where we're going to use our external style sheet. So next what we want to do is we want to go ahead and create that document that we're going to link to in our web page, HTML document, so that we can bring styles into that document. All right, so the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and create our CSS file. So I'm going to go up in my text editor. Let's create a new file. And in that new file, I want to do a save as. And I want to save this inside my underscore CSS directory and call it base.css. And go ahead and save that file. And the reason I saved it in the underscore CSS directory, if you remember back in our HTML document, we're actually linking to the style sheet that's in the underscore CSS directory / base.css. And we talked about this in earlier tutorials. This is actually the file name. This stuff I put after the question mark is how I track version numbers of my CSS files. It's not even required. You can actually pull it out, and this will work just as well if it wasn't there. So I'll go ahead and save that. Let's do a save as on this document. I want to go ahead and save this as chapter 19 underscore 19 underscore 01. And that's .html, because we're going to start making some changes now in that base.css file so we can actually style some of these documents. The first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and make the first change that we did when we were actually looking at using the style tag inside the head element. We used the universal selector to reset all our margins and to reset all our padding. Let's go ahead and do that same thing in our base.css file. So let's go ahead and put that star, the universal selector, open and closing curly brace, and let's put margin, :0 pixels, and that with a semicolon. I'm going to put a space, and then padding, :0 pixels, semicolon. So what I've done here is I've set my margin and my padding to 0. Notice I've got the open and closing curly braces on separate lines. I can actually do it like that if I wish. And you'll notice now that when I refresh the browser, let's go ahead and save this. Let's go back and refresh our browser window to get into our new document, chapter 19 underscore 01. Notice we have no margin and padding now. I can actually take these out, take all the space out, just like I had done in the previous exercise where we did it with the style tag. Save that again, and it will have no impact. It will work just as well without the spacing as it did with. So it's not unusual to see a lot of CSS tags put on a single line. Just want you to be aware of that. I normally do not do that because I like to actually keep my CSS separate a little bit so it's easier to read, but it's not unusual to put it on a single line. The next thing I want to do, let's go ahead and style our HTML tag similar to how we had done it in the earlier exercise. I'm going to go ahead and put HTML, open and closing curly braces. First thing I want to do, let's give it a width of 100%. If you remember from the earlier exercise, we did that. I want to give it a background color of gray, so I'm going to put pound CCC, give it that light gray background color. And I believe that's all we had. Let's go ahead and save that change. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser window. And you notice now we've got the light gray background color, and we are taking up 100% of the browser window as the HTML element. So you can almost imagine what we're going to do in the next exercise. All right, so let's continue to march with what we're doing. First thing I want to do is let's go ahead and save. Actually, I don't need to save this as a different file because we're just moving right along with. All right, so let's continue to march with what we're doing. The next thing I want to do is I want to do some styling on the body, and I'm sure you've probably guessed, based on how we did this before, I'm going to put in the body elements, my opening and my closing curly braces, and the first thing I want to do is give it a width of 80%. That should look familiar. We actually used that same setting when we used our style element, which was part of the internal styling that we could do inside of HTML. I'm going to give it a background color, and the background color I'm going to use is FFF, which is white. I am going to give it a font family, and this is going to be Arial. Then I'm going to put in a comma, Helvetica, comma, and then sans -serif, and that with a semicolon. The next thing I want to do is I want to add a font size, and I'm going to make the font size 0.8 And again, we'll get into a tutorial on discussing how these sizes work, because there's a whole bunch of different sizing elements we could use. We can use M's and X's and pixels. I use M's because it's relative to the screen that it's on. And the next thing after font size, I want to add a color. So we're actually going to add a color to our font, and I'm going to use my £1C5C78. For anyone that went through the previous tutorial, you know that's the base color of my website. I'm going to use well, actually, let's leave it like that. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Let's go ahead and refresh our browser window. And you can see now that we've got that styling element set up for the body tag. But like the last demonstration that we did, when I actually did it with the internal style tag, we don't have our body element centered inside of our browser window. And if you remember correctly, we can actually do that using the margin left and margin right. So margin left auto, and that with a semicolon, and then margin right auto, and that with a semicolon. Go ahead and save those changes, refresh the browser window, and now we've got that actual document centered inside of our HTML element by using the margin auto left and right. Cool, so now we've got our body styled. We've got our HTML element styled. One other thing I want to do before we get on the body is I want to add one more styling element to it. And if you remember from the last exercise, I put a little bit of a margin on the top, and that pushes that top of the body element away from the edge of the HTML element, and I'm just going to use 15 pixels. I believe that's the same setting we used in the previous demonstration. Save that change, go ahead and refresh our browser window, and we've pushed that body element 15 pixels from the top of the HTML element. So let's take this a little bit farther than we did when we were using the style element in the previous example. Let's go ahead and style an H1 tag. And if you remember correctly, the H1, or the heading 1 elements, we actually have 2 of them in this document, and I've picked this element for a reason you're going to see in a minute. I want to style these particular elements, these 2 H1 elements, using my external style sheet. So the first thing I want to do is I want to give it a line height. And what line height does, it actually gives it a distance from the top to the bottom. So instead of it being buttered, the box around the element being right against the text, we're actually going to give it a line height. I'm going to give it 1.8 em line height to give it some additional space, top and bottom, of the text element. Then what I want to do is I want to give it a background color. And we actually demonstrated this in the previous exercise. I'm going to give it a #36C, which is going to give us a dark blue. I want to put a vertical line, and there I want to put in center. That's going to center that text inside that line height. I want to put a padding left. Oops. I want to put a padding left in there of 25 pixels to push it away from this edge of our body element. So let's give it a 25 pixel padding left. And for anyone that doesn't understand the box model in CSS, I highly recommend you go into the CSS section of the website. I have 3 tutorials written on the box model that explains how padding and margins and borders work inside of our block elements. And it's really imperative, especially when we start doing things like styling our pages. And when I say styling now, I'm not talking about individual text styling, but I'm talking about styling the boxes that things are located in. It's really imperative that you understand the box model in CSS. So there are 3 tutorials in the CSS section of the website on the box model. Highly recommend that you view those. And after our padding left, let's go ahead and give the font a color. And I'm going to give the font a color of white. So we're going to get a FFF and that with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and save those changes. And I want you to see now what we've done is we've styled our 2 H1 elements. Remember, we have 2 H1 elements. We have this heading here, styling elements in HTML part 3, which is this very top area right there. And we have another H1 heading down here at the bottom that kind of oversees one line, styling elements using CSS and external style sheets. And I've picked these for a reason. You're going to see why right now. Let's go ahead and save this, refresh our browser window. And that worked really cool, except for one thing. My bottom H1 heading has so much text that it's run into 2 lines, and it doesn't look near as good as that top one does. So there's a couple ways that we can fix that. And we're going to look at that in the next demonstration. So what I was looking for when I was trying to style that H1 element, this element here, I was looking to style the title of this particular section of our web page. Now there's a couple ways I could correct this. I could actually go in and change this H1 element and make it something different, or I could go in and change the way I style the elements. I don't really want to change this element because when it comes to SEO, search engine optimization, headings are actually used in the spiders to help determine what's on your web page. And usually when I'm using these heading 1s, it's because it's an important topic in that particular section of the web page, and I want it picked up in the search engines. So if I'm looking at a way to just style this particular H1 and not all the H1s on the page, what I could do is I could give this H1 a class. Using a class attribute, and if you remember correctly, if you went through the earlier tutorials on attributes, we talked about this class attribute. Using a class attribute, I can actually give this a name of title or any other name I wanted. I could actually name this anything I want. And then I could pick out that individual H1 element by styling the class itself and not the actual tag. So let's save that change. Let's go back into our style sheet, and instead of styling the H1 tags, let's go back and style the title class. And you'll notice I started this with a period. That tells me that it's a class, and that's the name of the class that I'm trying to style, title. If I save that change, refresh my browser window, now I'm only styling that one individual H1 element that has the class of title. And if I wanted to style the H2 element the same way as I'd styled that H1, I could actually come down here and give it the same class of title, save that change, refresh my browser window, and now you'll notice I've got an H2 and an H1 styled the same way, but they're based on the class and they have nothing to do with the actual element ID or the element's tag name. Okay, and that's why it comes in very handy using classes in your style sheets if you're trying to style individual portions of a document and you don't want to identify that portion by the element tag itself. Alright, there's one more thing I want to look at before we wrap up this external style sheet tutorial. Alright, when we started this presentation we talked about one of the big advantages of using an external style sheet is the fact that I could design one style sheet and link it to hundreds or thousands of web pages so I'd have consistency across my website. Let me show you what I mean. I want you to take your chapter_01 HTML file. I want you to save as, and I want you to save that as chapter 19 _ home. Save a completely different name. And I want you to go in and I want you to remove the link to that style sheet. Save that file. Go back into our web root. Let's refresh it and load up that page. I want you to notice we're right back where we started. We have no stylings that are assigned to this particular web page. But to pick up all the stylings that we actually had from our original page, all I would have to do is go in here, type my link element, and in that link element, actually let's do it this way, it's a lot simpler. This way you don't have to, because this is how you would do it if you were doing this in real life anyway. You'd have both of your pages up, you'd grab your link element from the page you want to reference, you'd copy that using Control-C, you'd go to the new page, you'd go back to the link element, and you'd do a Control-V or Command-V to paste that into your new page. You'd save the new page, and now when you refresh that home page, it would have the exact same styling that your original page has. So I could link hundreds of pages or thousands of pages to this style sheet, and they would all assume those styles. And all I'd have to do if I wanted to change anything on any one of those pages, say I wanted to make my title reference a little bit different. I wanted my padding to only be 10 pixels, and I wanted to change the color of my fonts to yellow. I could actually go change it in the style sheet, save that style sheet, and it would come up that way in every one of the pages that was linked to this particular sheet. So I could make changes across my entire website just by modifying the external style sheet. And it makes it so much easier not only to get consistency with your web pages as you design them, so that you can have consistency in design across your site, but if you decide to change something, and as you'll see this as we work through these tutorials, it becomes so much easier to change it in the external style sheet than it is to try to go into every page and get everything exactly the same on a per page basis. It just doesn't work. CSS has made web design and styling of web pages so much easier since it was incorporated in HTML4. It has made our life as web designers so much more simple. So, I hope you enjoyed this series of tutorials. We talked about inline styles. We talked about internal style sheets, which is using the style element inside your HTML documents. And we talked about external style sheets and how they make styling your website so much easier and consistent across all your different web pages. Alright, so this concludes Styling Elements Part 3 in the HTML Essential Training Series. Over the last 3 tutorials, we've talked about using style inline styles. We talked about using the style element inside of HTML documents in the head section of our documents. We actually talked about using the scoped element of the style tag. And in the part 3 of the tutorials, we looked at using external style sheets and how you can use one external sheet to style multiple pages inside your HTML documents. Again, like I said, when we first started this group of tutorials, this was going to be a very high-level view of CSS. There's a lot to CSS. I wanted to do these 3 tutorials so you'd have an idea of what we're doing as we move forward in the HTML tutorials and start styling individual elements. But to get a real grasp of CSS, you really need to take a good CSS training course. I am building CSS training tutorials on the website. I would recommend going through those and get a much better grasp, a much better knowledge of how CSS works and all the things that are available in CSS to help you style your web pages. So I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial.